Welcome back, everybody, to our studies in the philosophy of death. This lesson is going to explore concepts related to dualism and the separation of body and soul, and the philosophical implications that this has towards death as a metaphysical event, and the metaphysical perspectives associated with the role of death in philosophy. So ultimately then, dualism is the philosophical position that humans consist of two distinct substances. They consist of the body and they consist of the soul. And this has played a foundational role in many discussions about death and the afterlife. It's rooted in philosophical traditions that I believe we will get to at various points in this series. Yeah, we'll get to at some point in this lesson. And essentially it posits that the mind or the soul can be separate from that of the body, and that the soul is often considered to be immaterial in some way, or even eternal in some way. And while the body is material and finite, the concept of dualism has had a profound influence on both Western religious and philosophical thinking, especially when we think about the nature of death and what happens after we die. And so when we think about dualism, the most famous illustration or elucidation of dualism comes from this individual here. It comes from René Descartes. Now, René Descartes was a French philosopher and mathematician who lived between 1596 and 1650 and was a prominent early modern philosopher who is one of the most famous proponents of a dualism that is known as Cartesian dualism. Now, according to Cartesian dualism, Descartes argues that humans are composed of two fundamentally different substances. These are the thinking substance, or the soul, which is sometimes described as res cogitans, and then you also have res extensia, which is the extended substance, or the body. This distinction is the cornerstone of his theory. We have firstly this idea of the soul and the existence of the soul. According to Descartes, the soul is immaterial, it is non-physical, and it is capable of thinking and reasoning and experiencing. It is distinct from the body, which is something that is composed of physical matter. The soul is the source of consciousness. It is the source of thought and self-awareness. It is indivisible and indestructible, and it does not follow the basic laws of the physical realm, of the physical world. By contrast, then, the body is the physical entity that is, in fact, subjected to the laws of physics, the laws of biology and chemistry, the laws of the universe. It is composed of material substances. For example, it's composed of atoms and subatomic particles and molecules and all these different kinds of things. And it operates according to mechanistic processes, so basic physical processes that can be boiled down to biology or to chemistry and all these different kinds of things. The body is finite, the body decays over time, and it eventually leads one to death. These are what Descartes describes as the sort of two distinctions between the thinking substance and the extended substance, the soul and the body. Now, Descartes believed that the soul and body interact with each other. Most notably, he says, through the pineal gland, which is a small organ inside the brain. That's what he believed was the sort of point of interaction between these two substances. While the soul is distinct from the body, it influences and is influenced by the physical state of the body. Now, Descartes, unfortunately, for all of his sins, did not provide us with a full and detailed explanation for how this interaction takes place. And this is actually, from a serious, if we're going to think seriously for a second, is a major problem with dualism. How do they interact with each other? You can't just say that they're separate and that they interact. How? How can this non-spatiotemporal concept of the soul interact with the spatiotemporal concept of the body? How do we reconcile these two things? Well, while he doesn't suggest and doesn't tell us how this happens, he still nevertheless does suggest that the mind can exert control over the body through the brain, and the body in turn can affect the mind. With all this being said then, what are the implications for the philosophy of death? Well, according to this version of Cartesian dualism, death is understood as the formal and continuous and the sort of final separation of the soul from the body. Since the soul is immaterial and is eternal, it can continue to exist after the body dies. And so as a result of this, for Descartes, death is the end of the functioning of the body, but it is not the end of the personal existence of a particular individual, of a human, of a soul. So as the body goes through the process of essentially being subjected to and succumbing to the physical world, the physical realm, so it decays and it ceases to function, the soul, on the other hand, because the soul is immaterial and because the soul is distinct from that of the physical processes of the physical realm, can persist beyond the death of the physical body. Now, many religious traditions like this view of dualism, and especially in Western thought as well, but also in other Eastern thought, align themselves with this dualistic concept of human nature, in which the soul essentially survives death and is judged or rewarded based on the actions of life. And so we can see this in various different religious contexts. In Christianity, for example, it is taught that the soul is immortal, and upon death the soul is to be judged by God. Those who have lived virtuously are rewarded with an eternal life in heaven, whereas those who do not are either live in purgatory or they go to hell. Now, this is a version of the human self and the concept of death that is influenced by dualism, in which the body is temporary and the soul is immortal. And so we see this distinction here. The separation of body and soul, then, according to Christianity, it allows for this sort of posthumous judgment and the continuation of the soul in somebody in the afterlife. In a similar sense, within Islam, there is also a sort of sense of dualism. There's a similar understanding of the soul's immortality. So after death, according to the Quran and to Islamic theology, the soul is believed to be put in the temporary state of waiting, until the day of judgment. The soul is then judged according to its deeds in life. And depending on the judgment, it may be rewarded in eternal paradise or punished in hell. Moving on to thinking about Hinduism, for example, we can see that there is the embracing of this form of dualism. However, it differs in its understandings of the soul's journey in death. Because according to Hindus and in Hindu thought, the soul, or Atman, is eternal and indestructible. But when a person dies, the soul leaves the body and is reborn into another form. This is known as reincarnation. Now, the soul's journey and where the soul ends up going is governed by the law of karma, where the actions of the past lives influence the conditions of the new life. And so death in Hinduism isn't the end, according to a materialist perspective that we looked at in the previous lesson, nor is it similar to the sort of Islamic or Christian perspectives in which it is the point at which you either go to heaven or hell. It is just a point of transition. The soul undergoes cycles of birth, death, and rebirth until it ultimately attains moksha, which is the liberation from the cycle of reincarnation. That is the idea of Hinduism. And then finally, you have Platonism, which is, of course, the ideas from the ancient world, the Platonic philosophy. So, of course, Plato influences both Christianity and later dualist thought, and he also espouses a dualist perspective of the soul. So in works such as Phaedo, for example, Plato argues that the soul is immortal and that it is only temporarily trapped in the body, and at which point, when death occurs, the soul is freed from the body and can return to the realm of the forms, where it exists in its purest state. If you want to know more about Plato and the philosophy of Plato, I have a series of videos already looking at that when we looked at ancient philosophy last year. So, there are various different perspectives of dualism, and there are various different religious connotations that are associated with dualism and spiritual ideas. Now, several arguments are also advanced in favour of dualism and the immortality of the soul, particularly in the context of death and the idea of death. So the first of these arguments is known as the argument from consciousness. So dualists will often point to the nature of consciousness and the nature of a subjective conscious experience, or a subjective qualia, as evidence that the mind is more than just that of the brain. So the conscious experience is thought to have a non-physical quality that cannot be ever fully explained by simple reference to the material processes of the brain. So the experiences of thoughts and emotions and, for example, self-awareness is evidence of a non-material soul or a non-material mind, however you want to describe it. On this account, then, according to dualists, consciousness cannot simply cease at death. It has to be non-reducible to physical processes, according to this argument. Another argument that dualists posits is the argument, of personal identity, or from personal identity. This argument is the idea that personal identity and the continuity of the self are both concepts that are not purely tied to the physical realm of the body. When we identify as ourselves based on our thoughts and our memories and our experiences, these are all ideas and these are all descriptors and predicates that seem to transcend the body. And so then personal identity may be able to survive the death of the body. The soul is thought to carry this continuity of identity, and so the idea of reincarnation in Hinduism and Buddhism suggests and reinforces this idea of personal identity. We can also see a number of dualist proponents present the argument from near-death experiences. They cite near-death experiences, or NDEs, as evidence that the soul does in fact survive after death. People who have been clinically dead or near death sometimes report out-of-body experiences. They sometimes report encounters with deceased loved ones or travelling to another realm. Now, the problem with near-death experiences is that the idea of death in a medical sense has sort of two meanings. You have the sort of idea of being physically dead, which is, I believe, the point at which the heart ceases or your heart rate stops for a certain period of time. But then you also have brain death. Brain death is when there is a complete cessation of brain activity. Now, nobody has come back from brain death. Okay, you can sort of die on the operating theatre or die in A&E or whatever, and you could be brought back with through various different processes in an ambulance, for example, or by a paramedic. That isn't brain death. That is different. So there's never been a case where a person's mental states and brain has completely ceased to function and then comes back. Okay, that doesn't happen. So that's one of the points that you should sort of challenge the near-death experience perspective on. But also, there's this view that when people claim to have had near-death experiences, they report near-death experiences that are aligned closely with concepts that are part of their sort of religious culture. So if you're in the West, you're more likely, if you have an NDE, to reportedly experience things that align more with Jewish or Christian or Islamic traditions about what happens when you die. Whereas if you are in the East, you're more likely to report things relating to Buddhist philosophy or to Hindu philosophy instead, which implies that this is just a physical phenomenon that takes place at the point at which somebody thinks that they're about to die. And that's what a materialist argues. But while a materialist may argue that these experiences can be explained by activities of the brain during times of extreme stress, a dualist will interpret these experiences as evidence of an immaterial soul that exists separately from the body. And then finally, of course, you have the argument from religious teachings. Many religious traditions hold that the soul is immortal and that death is merely a transition from one form of existence to a different form of existence. We've talked about this already. I won't go into it in more detail here. So with that being said then, what are the challenges associated with dualism? Well, it has a long history, and it does remain a popular view among religious people for the most part, but it does face several philosophical challenges, of course, especially in the context of modern science. The first of these is a problem that I raised when we talked about Cartesian dualism a second ago. This is known as the problem of interaction. Now, essentially, this is the challenge that dualism has to face when it comes to explaining how the immaterial soul can even interact with the physical body. If the soul is not composed of physical matter, how does it influence or control the body? Particularly, how does it influence or control the brain? As I mentioned, Descartes famously posited that it was the pineal gland, that was the point of interaction. But this is just a made-up explanation, essentially. It's not an explanation that has any scientific weight or backing. Modern scientific understandings of the brain and consciousness suggests that mental states are closely tied to physical brain states. And so this essentially gives credence to the argument that they are either one and the same, or that they are reducible onto each other, or that there is some kind of physicalist explanation to that particular interaction. Modern neuroscience also suggests that consciousness simply arises from complex neural processes in the brain. So, research has shown that when you alter brain functions, such as through diseases or through injury, this can radically change somebody's subjective conscious experience, their personality, their behavior. The famous example is of, I don't know his name, but the guy who had a spike that went through their head and took part of their brain out, and they somehow miraculously survived. And they reported to have a shift in personality after this experience took place. They were not the same. They had different conscious experiences. They had different personality. They had different behavior. It seemed to have altered their brain state. It seemed to have altered their mental state, their idea of consciousness. And so this links to the idea that you can alter brain function, and that can have a radical difference and radical change to your mental experience. This materialist explanation challenges dualism, of course, and the idea that consciousness can exist independently of the brain is seen as increasingly less plausible compared to a basic physicalist perspective when it comes to neuroscience and when it comes to understanding the brain from a scientific view and from a scientific standpoint. You also have the problem of the soul's existence. Another challenge is that there's just a lack of empirical evidence for the existence of the soul. While a dualist can argue that it cannot be studied directly and immaterial, a materialist will point out that there's no evidence of the soul's existence. And if you're going to tell me that you can't ever study the soul directly, then why am I ever going to believe that it exists? I could argue that there is a purple monster that flies around and follows you in the sky, a bit like Spyro, but you just can't see it. Well, okay, that you can't prove to me. You can't prove that that isn't the case, but at the same time, I can't prove that it is the case. We can just make things up like that all the time, and these are sort of unfalsifiable claims. And one of the things that science seeks to do is to provide explanations for things that are falsifiable, which means that not necessarily that they are falsified, but they are able to be falsified. That is what a good scientific theory posits, that you can falsify it. Finally then, despite these challenges, modern forms of dualism still continues to explore the idea of the soul's existence after death. And some philosophers advocate for a form of what we call emergent dualism, in which the idea of consciousness arises from the physical processes, but it has qualities that cannot be reduced to mental explanations. So it sort of takes the basic idea of emergentism from the previous lesson as a physicalist perspective, and then turns it into a dualist perspective. Now, this view suggests that consciousness may persist beyond death in some form, although, again, the specificities of this and how this actually works remains unclear. While religious dualism continues to shape beliefs about the afterlife, including things like reincarnation and heaven and hell, or spiritual evolution, these beliefs do offer solace to many and can provide a sense of continuity beyond the physical body when it comes to facing mortality, when it comes to facing the questions surrounding the philosophy of death.